Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all holding up well. Welcome to our lunchtime webinar. We provide the entertainment and you have to provide your own lunch, unfortunately. Times may change in the future. We can have you all around at our office and have a lunch here as well. Anyway, good to see so many of you attending our webinar today on enterprise investment schemes and seed enterprise investment schemes. Hopefully that the number of you that are here is an indication of green shoots in the economy. And I'm joined today by Phil Stevens, who heads up our tax department, and Keyur Doshi, who has been on a number of these webinars before. And we call him a seasoned McAlvanite of, I think, some 14, 15 years it must be now, Keyur. Maybe it's longer than that even. But great to have you both with me today. And without further ado, I think we should get started because we've got quite a lot to go through. I'd like to say it's all very exciting, but it's not really. Although I'm sure Keyur and Phil will make it as exciting as they can. So bear with us. Q&A as we go through, please raise any questions. There's a box somewhere on your screens. So raise any questions as we go through the webinar. If we've got time to stop and answer them on the fly, we will do. Alternatively, we'll save them to the end and cover them all off then. So without further ado, over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Tarek said, this webinar is on EIS and SEIS. For those that don't know much about the scheme, they are designed to attract investors to take a risk in startups and growing entities within the UK with the provision of beneficial tax relief. They're aimed incentives effectively to try and help with private investment into those growing and early stage businesses. They are very broadly similar, and SEIS is very often classed as the baby brother of EIS. There are some subtle differences that we'll touch upon as we go along, but broadly speaking, the conditions for one should apply to the other. Have the next slide, thank you. So in order to qualify for the scheme, an investment must be made by a qualifying investor. Now that's deemed to be an individual, so you can't be a company or other entity, it has to be a person. You have to be liable to UK income tax. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be UK resident, but you do have to have some exposure to UK income tax in order to gain the tax reliefs available. Otherwise, it's just a normal bog standard investment in a UK company. There's a very important point 3 there about the connection test. So you cannot be connected with a company in the period 2 years before the issue of the shares and 3 years after the issue of the shares. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the connection test is important because what the government don't want you to do is invest in something that you've got an interest in, i.e. it doesn't want people investing in their own companies. So it has to have an element of risk to it. So one of the ways of preventing people investing in their own companies is to put in this connection test, which means that you cannot hold more than 30% of the ordinary shares or exercise more than 30% of the voting rights. The connection test is also extended to include not only the investor themselves, but their immediate associates, such as family members, parents, children, brothers and sisters, etc. You can also not be an employee or director of the company unless it's in an unpaid capacity, something like a non-exec director, or it's in a reasonably paid capacity once you've been issued with the qualifying EIS or SEIS shares. The existing shareholders can also not obtain EIS relief unless all of their existing shares were issued under either SEIS or EIS, or they were original subscriber shares issued pre-trading of the company. In order for the shares to be qualifying shares, they need to be wholly paid up in the form of cash at the date the cash is transferred to the company. So what that means is if you are subscribing for shares which could potentially qualify, you need to have paid that cash over and received the share certificate within a reasonable period of time, i.e. almost immediately. We have had cases where HMRC have contested relief whereby somebody has transferred money to a company in the form of some type of loan and then tried to claim that that was an original EIS investment later on down the line, some months later. Ultimately, it failed in that particular instance. So it has to be an almost simultaneous money going into the company in return for qualifying shares. So the timing of a subscription of EIS shares is extremely important. They must be newly issued shares, therefore you cannot buy shares from somebody else and expect to obtain EIS or SEIS relief. They must be ordinary shares. They cannot contain any preferential rights to dividends, assets, distributions on a winding up, etc. from 3 years of issue. So it really does have to be a genuine investment of less than 30% for newly issued shares, and that means that the existing shareholders will be looking at a possible dilution of their interest as well, something that very often gets overlooked until the final minute, and then they realize that those people who already have shares in a company are going to have less than what they had previously. The funds from the share issue must be wholly used in qualifying trade or research and development. We'll go on shortly to a list of what is a qualifying trade for EIS and SEIS. But broadly speaking, it must be used within 2 years of the issue of the shares for EIS or 3 for SEIS. And it should be able to be easily demonstrated how the funds were used. So if somebody subscribed for EIS and they've paid in, say, £50,000, if you're spending that £50,000 on research and development or prototypes or trading activity for the qualifying trade, it should be fine. If you've gone out and bought a new asset which isn't necessarily wholly used in the business, HMRC would potentially question that and deny the relief for the shareholder. It cannot also be used for the acquisition of acquiring an interest in another subsidiary, another trade, intangible assets, or goodwill. So this is the list of accepted trades. Now, there's a lot on here that I think many of us will probably never ever come across, things like coal production, forestry activities, etc. I don't think there are many in and around Harrow. The typical ones that we tend to see people inquiring as to whether or not it would qualify would be dealing in land, shares, securities, property development, professional services like legal and accountancy, banking, insurance, financing, etc. So when you strip those out, it really is left to what you would class as a proper trade, something that's tangible, either a production of a product or a service that doesn't fall within these lists of accepted trades.
Interesting that accountants aren't considered a trade.
No. Well, I think the idea was that there's got to be an element of risk of loss of capital, and I think we come on to that shortly. Things like professional services like accountants, lawyers, etc. There isn't that necessarily that risk of capital because you don't really need a massive outlay. So I think that's why we were lumbered into the list of accepted trades. Some may argue differently, but
we invest our whole lives in knowledge, gaining knowledge and maintaining knowledge.
But it's that whole, that I guess you're setting up a business, there is an initial outlay. And what you tend to see is that startups these days are usually, most EIS and SEIS type businesses are something in the IT or R&D space, and therefore there is a chance that there's a lot of outlay in the initial period for assets and paying for services and contractors and whatnot. but there is a risk that will go horribly wrong. I think with something like an accountancy, once you've got a couple of clients on board, if you're servicing them, then you tend to grow, that risk factor diminishes as time goes on.
Well, indeed, but I suppose as time change, that will change also, won't it? So, for example, what would a e-commerce business qualify?
Yeah. There shouldn't be a reason why they couldn't. I think it depends on what the e-commerce actually, what the underlying product or service is. But yeah. I mean, I've had, just thinking off the top of my head, I've had previous clients whereby they were producing platforms for different government institutions, things like the Tube and airports, hotels, etc. And they were qualifying. We've had app development clients before who have qualified. So it's quite broad ranging. I think generally speaking, you've got to find something that is of interest for the investor as well. They're not necessarily going to put a load of money into a plumber, for instance. Sorry if there's any plumbers in the audience, but somebody who sets up a plumbing business is not necessarily going to be an EIS opportunity there. You tend to find it's something that's got that intrigue factor for the investor.
Mm-hmm. So something a bit innovative.
Yeah, typically speaking.
Okay, yeah, it's good to understand. I mean, there are a lot of very large plumbing businesses out there, by the way, Phil. The Pimlico Plumbers being one, I think.
Yeah, that's true, but then they probably breach the asset limits, which we'll come on to later as well.
Yeah, there you go.
That was a good segue.
Just to add, Phil, there are kind of businesses we have come across as a practice recently, Tariq. I won't put the names of the clients, but the two fintech businesses that we recently did advanced assurance for, and we keep seeing a lot more inquiries as well in that space. And when you look at the statistics released by HMRC as well, a big lion's share of the reliefs goes to the businesses involved in the IT sector.
Yeah.
So multiple release there, really, isn't it? We've got the SEIS release, but also the R&D tax credit release as well. So there's a number of things that can be pulled together in these sort of innovative trades.
Yep.
Yeah, especially as well if you're starting to think about intangibles and whether or not patent box tax relief will be beneficial to them. We've got the super deduction now for capital allowances. You've got increased annual investment allowed for capital allowances as well, that was in place before the super deduction came in. So there's a lot of relief out there at the moment for businesses. So if it is a time to really consider starting up in a particular niche area, then I think now is as good a time as any. And just following on from Keyur's point about advanced assurance, I don't think it's in any of the slides, but that's where you effectively go to HMRC and you get their approval that what you are doing in terms of trading activity qualifies, and you're getting their blessing, and provided you don't then breach any of the other conditions, you are guaranteed to get the EIS relief. So that is something you can go out, if you are the qualifying company, you can go out to investors and say, look, our product qualifies for EIS or SEIS, and therefore it's sort of an incentive for that investor to then get involved and put their money into the company. This is a point we touched on previously. There has to be a risk to capital invested. It has to carry a significant risk that the investors could suffer a loss to their capital, i.e. the funds they use to acquire the shares. There can't be any arrangements in place to protect the capital. I've seen over my career quite a few instances where people have tried to put in some kind of caveat or agreement whereby, side agreement whereby if I do end up investing and losing my money, I would like X, Y, and Z. It doesn't work. You just can't do it. There has to be a genuine commercial risk that you would lose the amount you've put in. Although, as Keyur will go on to when he's talking through the tax implications section, it's not 100% loss, because you do get the tax relief, and then there are additional tax reliefs for capital losses.
Great.
Okay, so we're on to the qualifying company conditions now. So as we mentioned, it must be a trading company and not one of the prohibited or excluded trades. It doesn't necessarily have to be a UK resident company either. Most people think it does, and to be honest, most qualifying companies are UK companies, but it can be a foreign company as long as it's registered in the UK for tax purposes. It must be unquoted, cannot be on any recognised stock exchange or marketed to the general public. Must meet a financial health requirement. There were 1 or 2 cases previously whereby the company was not in the best of health, shall we say, and was never going to go very far. Managed to get investment, partly through a capital loss ruse, I think, but it has to be shown that, you know, it's in reasonable health and there is a good stab at making it a trading entity, and it's not, you know, a loss-making entity. Must not be a 51% subsidiary or otherwise under the control of another company. The qualifying company itself can have subsidiaries.
Sorry about that. So yeah, there you go.
It's all right, didn't throw me at all. Yeah, it can have subsidiaries, but it can only have qualifying subsidiaries, i.e. it can only have subsidiaries that aren't on the list of accepted or prohibited trades. And these subsidiaries must be controlled by the parent. So investments in, you know, a 30% investment in a property dealing subsidiary would mean that that prevents the parent company from being qualifying. It must be a relatively small trading entity. So SEIS, as I said earlier, SEIS is the baby brother of EIS. So SEIS is typically for brand new startups that are less than 2 years old. EIS is for slightly more experienced companies or ones that are growing quite quickly, and you will easily exceed the asset thresholds or the investment threshold. So the asset threshold for SEIS, the company must not have gross assets in excess of £200,000. For EIS, that limit is up to £15 million before the share issue and not exceeding 16 million after the share issue. For SEIS, you're allowed to have 25 full-time employees. For EIS, it is 250, although there is an exception for knowledge-intensive companies, which we'll touch on very briefly later on. Shares. So for SEIS purposes, the company can only raise a maximum of £150,000 through SEIS qualifying investment. At that point, it moves over into EIS territory. So, and for EIS purposes, you're not able to raise more than £5 million in any 12-month period. You also then have to bear in mind that you've got the overall asset limits of 16 million. So you could do a couple of rounds of 5 million worth of investment, but then, you know, you're starting to get into the stage where you've actually breached the asset thresholds, and that doesn't qualify for EIS anymore. The knowledge intensive companies, as I said, do have a slightly higher threshold. So that for them is 10 million. And we'll touch on those, I think, in a couple of slides' time. So the lifetime limit for EIS companies is 12 million and 20 million for knowledge intensive companies. There is a slight question mark over whether or not the state aid rules apply. I know there were rumours that they thought things like EIS and SEIS was a breach of state aid when we were part of the EU. Now that we're no longer part of it, it's unclear as to whether or not there will be any further legal movement and whether or not we have to consider reducing, I don't know whether it's reducing the amount of the relief or the amount of the lifetime limit. So at the moment, everything is fine, but it's a case of very much watch this space. The company must have carried on the trade. This is quite an important point. The company must have carried on the trade for which the money will be raised at least 4 months in order for an investor to be eligible for EIS. What you typically, where EIS doesn't work is when you typically have a company that's set up and then people try and claim EIS straight away. I've had quite a few cases where an individual's made a claim for EIS on the basis that, you know, that they ticked all of the boxes and the qualifying conditions were met, only to fall foul of the fact that the company hadn't actually been trading for long enough, and it meant that they didn't get the tax relief, which is quite painful in one case because he'd put it on the tax return. There is an age limit on the company, so for EIS purposes, the company must have, or the share issue must take place within 7 years. 10 years extension for knowledge intensive companies. For EIS relief to apply, because it's based for really startup type entities, it must have been trading for a period of less than 2 years. There must be no pre-arranged exits with any investor, which is, I think, pretty obvious given what we've said so far. For SEIS to apply, you cannot have had a company as a qualifying EIS company prior to EIS, but once SEIS is breached, you can then move into the realms of raising funds through EIS. Would help if they actually made the acronyms different, and then we would be tripping over ourselves as we're going through this webinar. Hopefully that makes sense.
Probably not.
Probably
you lost me going through that. But we're here. We'll take calls afterwards. So
yeah,
Phil will anyway.
I will. Next slide, please. I think we're moving on to knowledge intensive companies. This is a relatively new addition to the EIS and SEIS type of relief. And it was born simply out of the fact that so many companies and so many things need this kind of knowledge intensive component that they wanted to get more people investing in it and taking the risk on these types of entities, and therefore they introduced the new knowledge intensive company extensions and enhancements to the relief and the qualifying conditions. So a knowledge intensive company will be a qualifying kick, as it's known, if one or both of its operating cost conditions are met and the innovation condition and or the skilled employees condition is met, which is as better clear as mud. The operating cost condition, so you need to have one of the following. You must have spent at least 15% of its relevant operating costs on research and development in one of the last 3 years, or 10% of its relevant operating cost on R&D in each of the last 3 years. Either or. Relevant operating costs are the total of all expenses that appear in the P&L plus cost of sale. Innovation condition means that the company must be engaged in work that creates intellectual property, hence the designation of a knowledge intensive company. And it's assumed that this IP that you're creating will be used for exploitation in the business at some point within the next 10 years. The skilled workers condition is actually quite a hard one to meet in reality, because at least 20% of the company's full-time equivalent employees must be what they deem to be skilled employees, which is defined as an employee who has at least a master's degree or equivalent and they're directly engaged in R&D innovation activities. 20% is quite a high threshold, because unless you've got a startup which has 2 or 3 employees, which is quite easy to achieve, as soon as you start getting into the realms of 5 or more, you know, that's quite a lot of people that you need to have at a certain level. And in practice, what I've seen is it is quite a difficult condition to meet. And I think that's the end of me. So I'll pass over to Keyur.
Thank you, Phil. Very informative. Keyur?
Yes.
Got quite a lot to go through in what is scheduled to be a very short amount of time. So
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Phil, for that talk, covering really the basics, very important basics of what are the qualifying conditions. As Tariq said, we are trying to cover a lot of the conditions and a lot of information in a very short webinar. But what I'll try and do here is take a step back and see why this is so important and so exciting, really. I mean, there's no better relief. When you really understand EIS and SEIS, either as a company or as an investor, both of you will be very excited about the very generous tax breaks that we have in our UK tax law at the moment. I mean, thinking about Brexit, COVID, impact on businesses, I think these reliefs are now worth much more than what they were 12 or 24 months ago. Businesses, especially in the Southeast where we are, London, Harrow, hospitality sector has suffered so much. I mean, successful businesses are going to struggle to come back online depending on how the lockdown eases and the roadmap develops. But businesses that have proven that they have a good model, good business, are going to struggle. They will need working capital to reestablish themselves. And for startups, the SEIS or existing business, the EIS reliefs are just what they will need when they want to come back online. So this has never been more important than now. And from the investors' point of view, high net worth investors' point of view, who look at this kind of investment opportunities, the tax breaks, again, you couldn't ask for more generous tax breaks. We have not seen that have been there. And just to throw some dates and numbers to this, EIS relief, and Phil, you will correct me if I'm wrong, EIS relief has been with us since 93, 94 onwards. So it's a very well-trodden path, legislatively speaking. Yes, there have been tweaks and some changes along the way, especially the risk to capital conditions and the knowledge-intensive point that Phil covered just a while ago. And SEIS has been with us since, I think, 2012, 13 onwards. So again, both the reliefs have passed both the Labour government and coalition and the Conservative governments, and the political view is there to support this. So changes are not expected in the near future coming into this. And the numbers released by Treasury or HMRC on EIS suggest that there are about 35,000 businesses last year being, okay, the latest figures we have is 2018-19, 35,000 businesses raised about £2 billion on the back of EIS. And the younger sibling, as Phil calls it, and in my book, rightly named seed EIS. I mean, it does what it says on the tin. It's for the seed money to start a business. All the startups in the last year, I think so the numbers were around 2,000 companies, 2,000 businesses raised about 160, 170 million pounds on SEIS. So these numbers are huge, and I think so they are still not maximized. Many businesses or many investors are not aware of this generous reliefs. And when you put the two together, we speak to many businesses who want to raise money and are already pitching to investors without giving them the cushion of this tax breaks, and the investors are investing. But when you add the reliefs available, the tax breaks, the parachutes available, if God forbids and the investment were to go wrong, it just becomes a no-brainer for both of them, the investor and the company. So just to go through the slides as well, I mean, the top numbers really to bear in mind why this is so much of value to the investors. So for the high net worth investors, investing in an EIS company gives them 30% income tax relief. So for every £100 they invest in an EIS company, they get 30p off their tax bill. SEIS is even more generous, rightly so, I think so, because you're investing at a very early stage in a startup. So by by its very nature, it's high risk. Chances of failure are higher. So the government has incentivized the high net worth individuals to take that extra risk by giving them more generous tax breaks. So SEIS, the investor gets 50% of the tax. I mean, just take a pause there and think, for every £1 you invest in a company, which you like as a business, as a disruptive technology or whatever business that they are going into, you get 50% of your investment back of your tax bill. Now, that's not all. I mean, there are other reliefs built around it further as well, around CGT deferral relief, as we call it under EIS, and CGT reinvestment relief, as we call it under SEIS. Very briefly, what it means is it helps for EIS investors, it helps 28% of your investment cash flow to be funded again from your CGT liability, and your CGT tax bill is deferred until you exit the investment. So 30% you're going to get your money back from tax relief, income tax relief. 28%, assuming you are paying that level of capital gains tax rate on a property disposal asset, you can fund that tax back into the EIS investment. Whereas with SEIS, it gets even better. You not only get a deferral, but you're getting actually 50% relief. So your CGT rate becomes effectively half. So if you're paying CGT at the rate of 20% or 28%, it becomes 10% or 14% for you. Now, that's not all. I mean, you can see why I'm so excited about SEIS and EIS, right? Because the reliefs are just there. There are reliefs still on the upside and further reliefs on the downside, and rightly so, I think so. The relief on the upside is fab. I mean, and that's why it was important to understand all the conditions that Phil went through. All these reliefs are contingent on the company fulfilling all those conditions, the investor fulfilling all those conditions for the entire qualifying period, which generally is 3 years. But assuming you tick all those boxes, and there's no reason why you would not, and we can assist you with all that. After the end of 3 years, when you take it, the investor taking any exit, be it £100,000 investment in a startup which is worth $1 million, 2 million, 3 million, there is no upper cap. The entire gain is tax-free. I mean, there are not any other generous relief I know in our UK's tax law that is so generous, where there's zero tax with no upper cap on the gain. That's on the upside for the investor. What about the downside? And I think so that's really where the entrepreneur has to understand these reliefs and sell it to his potential investors, is to say, look, yes, this is risky. There's no two ways about it. But my venture, if you like it, the downside protection that you get from the tax breaks is so good that in the worst case scenario, if the business were to fail, which statistically speaking, chances would be, I don't know, 60%, 70%, 80% for SEIS type companies, you will still not lose as much as you think you will lose. And we have done some number crunching on that, and we can share it with you. But when you take into account the income tax relief, if CGT reinvestment relief is available or CGT deferral relief is available, it helps. But there's one more relief that I've not touched upon, is loss relief. If after the qualifying period, let's look at a scenario, the worst case scenario, as I would like to call it, the business has failed, the net investment value. So if you have invested in an SEIS company, your net investment is 50% of your original investment, because 50% you have already received back. That is again available to be offset against your income. And assuming you are a marginal rate taxpayer of 45% or 40%, that losses are worth another 40% in tax relief back to you at that point. So on both sides, be it looking at the positive success of the business, or looking at the downside, both scenarios are very well catered for with generous tax breaks. Sorry, Tariq, the slides I've not really stayed on with because of the time issue that you really picked on at the start of my session, but we'll go through them now if I've missed any points. But I think so that's really the gist of understanding why SEIS and EIS are so valuable, both for an investee company wanting to raise funds, be it a startup, be it a successful business impacted by COVID, or a successful business not impacted by COVID or growing because of COVID, because they're an online business, but wants more working capital to fund their growth and their growth story. That all the companies, all the hospitality sector that has been impacted wants to come back on its feet again. Startups, all of those companies are ripe other than those excluding trades, as Phil touched upon, should really look at EIS and SEIS whenever they consider of raising funds. Yep, we have considered the EIS disposal relief, Tariq. If you move to the next slide. Time limit. There are various conditions. I think so. What is important, what we have not covered by sticking to the slides, and something to mention here. Yes, the reliefs are generous, but you would expect, as you would expect from the government, from HMRC, there are various conditions attached to make sure you stay within the rules to get and qualify for all this generous relief. There are various time limits within which the claims needs to be made, various compliance processes to be followed. For example, you should receive your EIS 3 certificate before you can apply for your relief. But all that we can handhold both sides, either from the investor's perspective or from the company business perspective. But all those conditions are really important, because one mistake and there are draconian clawback clauses in the legislation where all these reliefs can be clawed back if you get it wrong. If you move to the next slide, Tariq. Yeah, I think so. As Phil said, the conditions, the reliefs are really mirroring each other to an extent. There are nuances that I've touched upon on the reliefs, 50% for SEIs compared to 30%. The amounts that you can invest are different, £100,000 in SEIS, whereas $1 million in EIS, 2 million if it's knowledge intensive companies. One other important point to understand, we are talking about this in April 2021-22 tax year, but from an income tax planning perspective, investments made in this tax year, April, May, June, or for the next 12 months, you have the option to carry it back 1 year as well. So this could be a very powerful tool to do some income tax planning for the year gone, finished as well. If we move to the next slide, please. Yeah, we touched upon how important it is to get your certificates before you make your claim.
And that carryback of the relief is fantastic, really, because obviously you've got your tax bill, right, and here's a way of saving maybe 50% of it, and invest in a business that could obviously be a fantastic sort of growth opportunity.
Yeah, we were speaking to a client yesterday, Tariq, and he wanted to make pension contributions to mitigate some of his super bumper profits he had. But pensions can only be done in tax year. You cannot do it for retrospectively. You can't carry it back in terms of getting the tax relief at the business level. So we advised him about looking at EIS and SEIS and mitigate his tax bill for the year gone via that. If you move to the next slide, yeah. We've touched upon all these reliefs, disposal reliefs. I mean, very generous when you take an exit, subject to you ticking all the boxes of the qualifying conditions and the qualifying periods. Zero tax. I know there are changes that have already happened to the entrepreneur relief rules. So businesses that would have otherwise qualified for 10% are now likely to be subject to 20%. And financial press is full of talks about the CGT rates going up in the next budget. So if you can get into a vehicle, into a structure, into a wrapper, which is likely to be tax-free, and hence I touched upon why these reliefs have survived both conservative and Labour governments, because you're looking at 3 to 5 year period, because that's your exit plan. The chances of them trying to tamper with this relief is very, very low. So to be able to be in a position where you believe in a business and that's why you're investing, but also knowing the upside, you have no tax leakage, could be fantastic. If we move to this next slide. Yep. Not a deferral, we've covered that. So very, very generous tax relief on SEIs. I think so we've covered all the slides. I think so we could very much, yep, next one, Tariq, we've covered all of that. Reinvestment relief. Yep.
That's the last slide, Keyur. You've done.
Yeah, I think so we've covered it all. So it gives us good 5 minutes for some Q&As.
Yeah, there's a few. I haven't had any questions come up on the screen at the moment. So if anybody has got any questions, please do reach out. Quick one from me. We've talked a lot about the commercial side of the application of the schemes and how that can benefit you from your sort of income tax planning and so on and so forth. However, what about EIS investments as an effective tool in IHT planning? That's either or both of you.
I think it's very effective, actually. I mean, when you think about the value of equity that people are sitting on in real estate, the older generation, and there's a lot of talks about how inheritance tax is a problem for them. And it's a catch-22. If they dispose of the asset to gift the money to the next generation, they trigger the 28% CGT rate. So it becomes a very, very difficult position whether you want to pay 28% in your lifetime or 40% on death. And many times we see clients just do nothing because of that. Whereas if cleverly used, EIS or SEIS with its CGT deferral relief or CGT reinvestment relief can mitigate the tax at the point of disposal, also move you to an asset class that is BPR qualifying, business property relief, which is very quickly within 2 years of investment can become free of inheritance tax. So the right combination for the right investor, right client profile, it could be, I mean, it sounds too good to be true, but we have had that kind of practical scenarios where clients have migrated from a real estate pregnant capital gains tax portfolio, liquidated without triggering capital gains tax, rolled into EIS shares, and changed their asset profile in a very IHT friendly environment.
Okay, that's some good question. Phil, anything to add on that?
No, I mean, Kay has covered everything. I think by default, the fact that you're investing in a trading entity for EIS or SEIS purposes means that, like you said, if you hold on to it for the 2 years, which is one of the prerequisites in terms of how long you need to hold on for the EIS shares in order to avoid the clawback, it becomes effectively IHT free. So if you do have a client or if you are in the position where you have surplus cash, for instance, or gains that could be potentially rolled over into a qualifying investment, it not only does it save you on the CGT side, but it also, in a little space of time will save you on the IHT side as well. So it's a double whammy from the capital taxes planning point of view. And
you mentioned clawback, and we've got less than a minute until we have to end. Obviously, there's been with lockdown, furlough, all the funding that the government, we ultimately will have funded, getting us or keeping us out of the mess we could be in. How do you see things like SEIS and EIS and business property relief and so on and so forth changing over the next sort of year or years to help with that clawback of money spent basically over the past 12 months?
I think from the EIS and SEIS point of view, there may even be some kind of enhancement to it to try and get people those who are able to invest in fledgling companies and to try and get more businesses up and running. Mm-hmm. Whether there will be any sort of curtailing of that at some point in the next few years, because it is a very beneficial relief from a tax perspective. It's just whether or not it's widely used enough to make a dent in the finances. Mm-hmm. from the BPR point of view, I mean, we know it's under consultation at the moment as to whether or not that's going to remain in force. And things like the CGT rates, like Keyur mentioned earlier, and other reliefs are probably under the microscope. I don't see anything happening on the IHT front in terms of relief for at least another couple of years. CGT, I can see something happening in this coming budget, which would probably kick in from April next year at the earliest. So it's a very, I think, volatile area of tax. I think there will be wholesale changes in the next 2 to 5 years across everything. But it's like everything, isn't it? In the last 12 months, the pandemic's caused all kinds of disruption. And if we do get a third wave, how will that impact? It's an unknown. So I think if you are in a position where you can benefit from it now, it's definitely worth giving it some extra thought.
So time is of the essence, and we've got the next,
absolutely,
well, less than 12 months now to sort of deal with something. So any clients listening, Phil and Keyur are your men for the task at hand. Thank you, Phil and Keyur, for providing all of that insight. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much, Joe, as well, for helping us pull everything together. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. And thank you for everybody that's attended. We look forward to seeing you soon. If there's anything we've missed, any other questions, there was a lot to go through, do feel free to reach out to either Phil or Keyur, and they will do what they can to help you on your way. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.